Flying is the most fun a girl can have without taking her clothes off. Okay, but have you tried crocheting them instead? What better way to spend the run-up to Valentine's than to recreate one of the most iconic outfits from one of the most, dare I say, realistic romance movies to ever exist? Is it the 90s or is it just dark in here?
I don't have the right tape, so I'm using this whiteout tape.
To gain a grasp of where to begin, I started off by marking out the desired shape and pattern on the ugliest, ill-fitting bra I could find. You're confused? I'm confused. This is going to be the rough shape of the cup. And then the first, or rather the second crochet piece, will just be a straight piece along this edge. But yeah, that's... okay. I'm just gonna pin these in place. The first attempt didn't look quite right, but we were onto something. A few adjustments later, I finally had an outline I could work with, hopefully. For the yarn I'll be using, you guessed it, a sports weight cotton and a warm lilac with my trusty 3mm crochet hook. I did wonder about using a heavier yarn for this, but I'm glad I didn't. All I had to do for this first part was crochet the shapes I marked out on the stand. I began at the bottom with the irregular ellipse for the base. It felt a little strange to crochet from such a narrow point, but it wasn't difficult. The worst part about the whole process was just how tedious and repetitive it was. You might be thinking, wait, aren't you crocheting? Isn't tedious and repetitive the aim of the game, the raison d'etre? Yes, but that's not what I was talking about. I'm referring to the constant, mind-numbing size and reference checking. It is without a doubt that one could just make life easier with a regular, symmetrical oval. However, the last time I checked, Alice was the only character in the film who didn't cheat. Honestly, the story was so confusing, I don't even know if that's true. And in the same spirit, I too was going to suffer the consequences of doing the right thing. This wasn't the best idea. That being kissing multiple frogs until finding the perfect match. Badum-tsh. After finishing the piece off in the opposite way in which it started, things were looking half decent. I think this fits pretty well. Except, it was a lot flimsier than I had anticipated. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't single crocheting a sports weight yarn, expecting exoskeletal armor in return. That being said, the structure felt almost non-existent. Because if I fold it over, I feel like that looks about right. Now, you may be confused. I mean, where's the problem when the original costume was made with a sheer lace? Well, you got me there. I actually wanted to make a more, shall we say, opaque version of the top. For one, this is YouTube, not OF. And two, I've wanted to try crocheting a structured top for quite a while, so what better opportunity than this? Anyway, this choice was going to cost me dearly in both time and motivation, but by Jove, was I determined to make it worth it. It goes without saying that I then had to repeat the same pattern 3 times for 4 pieces in total. I'm not going to lie, all of this conjured up images of purple chickens, and I won't go into it any further. Apart from this, macaroni with the purple chicken strips.
Oh.
And well, I genuinely couldn't believe that everything was going so well. Ah yes, the art of speaking too soon. Of course, I then had to crochet the second part of the cup. In hindsight, I could have done this vertically in line with my previous work, but I chose to do it horizontally as it would have less stretch and would therefore create more shaping? Well, kind of. And then I had an idea. What if, to connect the 2 layers together, I made the top edge into a fold over? This would help avoid any unnecessary seams while simultaneously creating an irresistibly neat finish. If you know, you know. It's not perfect, but it fits okay. It wasn't the end of the world, but it was a bit of a bummer. Eventually, I ended up with these, and yes, they looked too big for the stand because they were, kind of. They were giving a completely different shape and silhouette to the original, but honestly, after all of this, I wasn't looking back. It wasn't bad, it was different. More importantly, I was willing to see where it went. And before I could go any further, the embellishments had to be made before everything else was closed up. This was so that all the messy ends could be concealed. The number of movie references I could make with that alone. Anyway, for the flower-like star, or rather star-like flower appliques, I was going to crochet 5-point stars using a size 3 mercerized cotton thread in a light pink. Now, believe me when I say this color choice was not made easily. In fact, it may prove controversial. In the end, I made the executive decision to go all out with this color, because even if I'm wrong, and I may very well be, at least it'll look good. Am I right, or am I right? Honestly, I also think it's the color that goes best with the purple and makes the most sense, but I digress. Having never crocheted a star before, it took a couple of attempts to get just right, and I only had to make 2 of them, so enough said. Actually, they were pretty fun to make, and I really enjoyed working with the shiny thread. At this stage, things are generally just as hopeful as they are concerning, but something just wasn't sitting right, and the most tragic part of it all was that I knew why. It was the fold over. It was too clean, too sharp, and too modern looking. There were plenty of other silhouettes I could imagine it for, but just not this one. I also overlooked a major detail, which was the ribbon trim, and although I could probably work my way around it, this was a good place to fix it. And so the first bubble had finally burst. It was about time, although I could and should have spotted it earlier. Honestly, I got too excited and carried away with the appliques. Nevertheless, it was a good reminder to pay closer attention to the reference material. Could you perhaps crochet a significant other, you ask? Why not? If you start now, you'll be done in time for next year. It's 2023. Don't be so closer-minded. I'd tell you I'd stop, but it would only be a lie, and lying is the most fun a girl can have without crocheting her butt off. As if it needed to be said, there was a lot of unraveling to do, with an addition of a treble crochet row to accommodate the soon-to-be ribbon detailing. I added some scalloping as well, because I'd surely regret it otherwise. Not expecting it to make a huge difference, but it kind of did, thank goodness. I just had to do the same thing all over again. It goes without saying that it would be ideal to complete one side first before starting the second, but then again, the course of true freehand crochet never ran smoothly. Plus, it's difficult to see how something works without the other half, especially on Valentine's Day. Sorry, that one was below the belt. As the name implies, it was time to apply the appliques, and that was simple enough, or so I thought. You know, I was happy with the idea of sisters instead of twins, but these 2 were cousins twice removed, so in the end, I was just aiming for immediate family. I still can't believe this ate up an entire evening. With that done and dusted, I now had to tackle the inner corners. This garment was by far the most familiar, yet foreign to me. It was foreign in the sense that I'd never owned or worn anything like it, yet it was also uncomfortably nostalgic in how inherently 2000s the embellishment and detailing was. All of this is to say that I wasn't sure about these swirls at all. I was barely sure of them on the actual costume, let alone slip-stitched versions of them on crocheted cotton. Fortunately, every cloud has a silver lining, and for my first time using this technique, it was enjoyable in the technical sense, apart from the tidying up, that is. It doesn't make sense, but it is working. Now, you might be a bit disappointed that sequins won't play any part in this project. I didn't have any, and honestly couldn't justify all the cons that would come with them. But I did have a wide selection of beads. Here is your daily dose of ASMR. Sorting got a little addictive, and I picked up way too many. Luckily, the beading turned out well, although it was a little tricky to know when to stop. I then proceeded on to making the ribbons, which I just slip-stitched together. I used a safety pin to thread the ribbon through the top edges, and this was by far the most successful part of the detailing in my honest opinion. And with the highs soon came the lows, aka weaving in the ends. I could have just sandwiched them up in there, but who knows what would happen to them over time. Nonetheless, it was all coming together quite well, and each step made me a little more confident about the result. So the beading definitely gives a different effect to what sequins would have done. I do like the rounded beads, but I think these more angular beads work less well. A few small changes here and there, and I was finally on to closing everything up. To do this, I knit an attached I-cord to the bottom edges. Of course, you can also crochet the edging instead. You say tomato, I say potato. Ultimately, knitting felt like the easier option for me at the time. And yes, I was aware of the disparity in tension. It was my intention. I think this I-cord sits a bit too wide, so I'm going to take some stitches away. To balance things out, I initially increased the stitch count, but I went a bit overboard with it. But then with the second cup, I decreased the number of stitches, so I think I'll just have to undo this one and do the same thing as I did on this side. I used the same number of stitches for both I-cords, but the first one here definitely looks bigger even though it isn't, and that's just because everything is just squished together. This decrease in stitches managed to shape the cup somewhat more than expected, but in a good way. It was a happy accident that would make Bob Ross proud. I started crocheting the strap, but I've also noticed now that I put it on the stand that it's a bit too short. So I'm going to add a few more stitches at the bottom so that it kind of almost levels out. My only concern is that it might end up slanted, but hopefully it doesn't. Crocheting the band was relatively straightforward, and I single crocheted to maintain consistency. Despite doing my due diligence with the measurements and factoring in stretch, the fact that the band didn't fit across the stand completely caused quite the kerfuffle. I've kind of messed up the shaping a little bit, so this point here, which is another peak before it goes down again, should actually be closer to the back than it is to the side. So I'm going to have to undo until this point again, and then continue with this number of stitches until maybe about here or so. Fortunately, however, this was a total red herring, and I was actually right all along, or so I believed. Of course, it wasn't over yet. Regardless, it was a close one, and I almost frogged it all. This is way too difficult. To finish each strap, I incorporated some Tunisian crochet, something I'd been using quite a lot recently. I've already said too much. Again, I just had to repeat the same thing but mirrored, which had its own challenges. I can't remember what I did. In terms of what I did next, I thought it was a good idea, but let me tell you precisely why it wasn't. Basically, I wanted to loop the ribbon detailing from the back all the way over the shoulders to form a strap. This was a terrible idea, because not only was it for the most part inaccurate, it also made this happen. On the bright side, because it's mostly all I have at this point, I was able to make a multitude of treble crochets, a stitch that I have grown to enjoy greatly. And if my subconscious could just be honest with my conscious for once, it might just admit to that being the reason for it all in the first place. What I was supposed to do was just work from the top of the front pieces and eventually attach the straps to the back. Simple. Having learned my lesson, I corrected the remaining side and got started on the pink ribbons, for which the majority of the work came from triple checking the stitch count. No! Well, when life gives you lemons. Okay, let's see how this turns out. I think we can work with this. In the end, I continued the treble crochet and lace ribbon for the entire strap instead of just the front portion. So again, -1 for accuracy, but +1 for personal preference. Take that to its logical conclusion, and somehow everything just makes sense. This is all a zero-sum game. Finally, the fringe portion of this project had arrived, and my feelings surrounding it were complex to say the least. On one hand, I was excited by the prospect of twirling in fringe, whereas on the other hand, I was absolutely petrified. I hadn't sampled anything, and the odds of getting this all right on the first try were less than nothing. To attach the fringe, I first needed to create another ribbon of some sort, so I started to make one with Tunisian crochet. My first attempt seemed a little narrow for what I had imagined, but this was a bit of a proportional conundrum. Say that 5 times fast. The bra/bralette was all round considerably larger than the original, so I wasn't sure if I should attempt to match the actual or relative size of the ribbon. Anyway, this was all quite redundant in the end, because this is what it ended up looking like. Yes, well, don't say I didn't warn you. It was back to the drawing board with another knit I-cord. I'd like to think that there was an even better solution out there, and that given enough time, I would have discovered it eventually. Perhaps this was nothing more than wishful thinking, but all things considered, the I-cord solution was good enough. The original trim was sparkly, but I was going to see how this one turned out before adding anything to it. I really don't want to do the next part. I haven't sampled it at all. I don't know if it'll work out. I don't even know if this yarn is the right yarn. We'll just have to see if it also makes good fringing. Another round of weaving in, and it was time to attempt the actual fringe itself. Now, I have quite a bit of explaining to do. I could, and it would in fact be more correct if I cut long lengths of thread and slip knotted them into the ribbon I just made. And because I purposefully chose not to get a nylon thread for this project, because I wanted to keep the materials relatively limited and cohesive, I was going to use the same pink cotton. This would mean that frayed edges were inevitable, and I really didn't want to make knots at the ends. Not only did I think it wouldn't work well aesthetically, I also cringed at the thought of storing and caring for the garments long term. Just think of the tangles, the crinkles, and the absolute rigmarole of having to steam everything straight. Needless to say, it wasn't a road worth travelling, so I chose to use a twisted fringe instead. Let's try that again. It would be more robust, and I assumed the twist would also help to bring out the shine of the mercerized cotton. Yeah, I'll get back to you on this. Of course, I still had no idea if it would work at all. I'd never even attempted a twisted fringe before, let alone in such a loaded context. This is an improvement. I think we did it. Although I was already anticipating a lot of rotating to form the twisted fringe, it quickly dawned on me that there was going to be much more than I could even fathom. The only thing holding me back was biomechanical, and it would be dishonest of me to say that I wasn't just a little scared. After some trial and error, the results were beginning to look promising. You've likely noticed that this fringe is a lot shorter than the original. At this point, I wanted to do everything in my power to avoid a tangled mess, and I figured that a shorter fringe would not only avoid this, but also potentially look more flattering if done the right way. But in truth, it was simply a diluted version, or would diluted be more appropriate? It was giving less gentleman's club and more Coachella. No matter how much I reasoned with myself, no, begged myself to simply continue and finish the damn thing, the truth remained that this was nothing more than a cop-out. Suffice it to say, regardless of my aesthetic preferences, tired wrists, and the all-pervasive, never-ending sense of what on earth is happening, luckily the second attempt was much better. So using the hook was really starting to strain my wrist, so I decided to MacGyver this little thing. I started to use this cable needle, and that was a bit slippery, so then I added a little hair elastic, and it works really well. Look, I could go into an entire discussion on the fit and how the original top sat unusually high at the back, thus requiring a longer fringe to reach roughly the same depth, but that would just be pointless. Why? Because I realized that the level the fringe draped down to was not what gave the alluring effect of the outfit. It was, in fact, the length of the fringe in and of itself. Truthfully, things also looked a little boxy at this length, and that was just not it. Okay, I'm going to hate myself for saying this, and you probably will too, but it still wasn't long enough, and I was going to redo it all. After all, third time's a charm, right? Because I've made the fringe longer, I have to also make these front parts longer as well so I can tie them together. They were a bit too short to begin with anyway. I also think I might have to retwist some of this fringe, and I'll probably also have to steam it as well. I have carried on the same spacing all the way up the side here, and I was a little concerned that it might be a bit crowded, but at the same time, I actually appreciate the fullness, so I think I'm just going to leave it. And besides, I think it's a bit too late anyway. In the end, redoing the fringe for the third time was definitely more than worth it, and naturally, it brought the whole thing closer to the original. That's the last one, I promise. This project ran way over schedule and is obviously not the entire outfit, but pink wig aside, it is the most iconic part, and I'm more than satisfied with that. Happy Valentine's. May all your romantic endeavours be far less complicated than this project.